Biomutant sure is something. It's not a bad game per se, but it certainly isn't a good one either. It honestly could have been incredible, with a wild, zany post-apocalyptic world, over-the-top combat, genuinely weird creature designs, and the narrator from Stanley Parable dropping snarky quips as he narrates your entire journey throughout the game. But it's also a game that fell short on all of those accounts. You can see all of that potential if you play it, but it never reaches what it could have been, what Experiment 101 had advertised that it would be. It's honestly a common story. A small studio with a limited budget, but really big dreams, tries to make something amazing, and just doesn't cut it. Biomutant is a game that you honestly hate to hate, and desperately want to love, but just can't quite ever fully enjoy it throughout all of its flaws. Hi, I'm Wanderbot, and I'm here today to take a long hard look at Biomutant's roughest edges, how to potentially fix them, or how other games could avoid them entirely. Before I get too far, I should mention that this isn't a formal review. I haven't finished the game, and I'm not nearly masochistic enough to sit through another 10 to 15 hours of bewildered drudgery to do so. But I have played enough to at least take a long hard look at some of the things that could have been done better. I should also say that none of my opinions are set in stone, and if Experiment 101 goes back and really polishes Biomutant to perfection, I'll gladly sing its praises. It's a game that would have been a solid 7 to 8 out of 10 as an early access title, had they decided to go that route. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get started. Issue number 1. The world is just too dang big. Ocean wide but puddle deep is not good game design philosophy. Making a giant, vibrant, open-world game that is engaging enough for players to stick around in for dozens, if not hundreds of hours, is hard. Ridiculously hard. And the bigger the map is, the more content and variety that the developers need to pack in to keep things feeling fresh and interesting. As such, most open-world games should actually be built around the content that the developers have made, and if that means a smaller open world, then so be it. But in Biomutant's case, it honestly feels like they made a giant open-world map with the expectations that players could easily spend 50 hours or more adventuring through it, but then only made enough content to justify 10 at most. The enemy variety is fairly limited, loot is pretty random and often disappointing, locales are desolate with very little to actually do, and ultimately traversal feels more like going from just point A to point B than really exploring the game. Overall, they would have probably saved themselves a tremendous amount of time, shrinking the map to about half or even a third of its size, if not more so, and then allocating their extra time and resources into making that map much more interesting to explore, especially with more exciting set pieces that are actually worth seeking out and adventuring through. Not only for the loot, but for the sheer joy of going through them. Too many of Biomutant's towns and outposts especially are cookie-cutter copies of each other, when they should have been unique encounters or micro-dungeons that, may reuse a couple of assets, but never ever reuse layouts. As an aside, I actually got to play Biomutant at PAX East 2019 for about 15 minutes, and it was actually a really cool linear scripted series of events, showcasing the combat, exploration, narration, platforming, and more. And it was a lot more fun than its current incarnation, largely because it was non-stop, over-the-top action with little in the way of bloat. Kinda wish they'd stuck with that format and gone with a far more linear, high-energy, handcrafted experience instead. Give me big, bombastic characters to interact with, levels that are fun to run through and rarely if ever repeat, unique boss fights that are as epic as they are memorable, and if it ends up only being about 10 hours long, so be it. Because I'd truly rather have a short but incredibly satisfying experience rather than a long, drawn-out, and ultimately disappointing one. Issue number 2. The combat is, frankly, kinda wonky. Honestly, this might be the most important thing to fix. Biomutant has a pretty decent combat system that's just in desperate need of some focused feedback testing and retooling. It's got a lot of style, and the bones for a better system are already there. So if they actually sit down to perfect it, I think it'll help the game feel a lot better, and in turn help people feel better about Biomutant overall. First up, I'd actually start with the sound design. Better sound design should be first on the list, with much heavier blows and visceral slices, so that even if my hits aren't actually that big, they'll still sound like it, and feel like it. Next up would be hit feedback. Make the enemies react to the hits that I'm throwing out. I ended up giving up charged power attacks with my big old mechanical fist because half of the enemies I hit didn't even flinch, and actually managed to get off a few good strikes on me in the process. AI. I'll concede that AI programming is probably the hardest thing to fix, but as it stands, most of the enemies in the game are incredibly one-note, and will charge directly at the player with no semblance of tactics, and often in blatant disregard of their own self-preservation or the well-being of their allies. It would go a long way to have enemies that try to encircle the player, or to place themselves defensively in front of their ranged attackers to prevent the player from picking them off first, or to put distance between themselves and the player if the enemy has a ranged attack. As it stands, they're all just universally vulnerable to kiting, and prone to mobbing the player if they attempt to fight in melee, which just feels kinda awful because of parrying. Parrying in games is extremely hit and miss, where a fine-tuned parry system can feel incredibly satisfying and rewarding, nullifying enemy attacks and allowing players to pull off devastating counterattacks in their wake. On the other hand, a poor parry system will inevitably drive players away from ever parrying at all, forcing them to resort to exclusively using the dodge roll, if there is one, or awkwardly kiting enemies with hit-and-run attacks instead. Biomutant belongs to the latter category for sure. The parry system is inconsistent at best, and while it's incredibly satisfying pulling off a big parry counterattack combo, actually getting the timing down for a parry is an exercise in frustration. When facing foes in single combat, it's honestly not that bad, since you can pay attention to their animations, but the moment you're up against 3 or more foes, parrying just isn't worth it anymore. Most games have enemies that bizarrely wait their turn to attack, which, yes, it looks silly, but it's there to give players the chance to handle each threat one at a time, even in a crowd. But for Biomutant, the enemies just mob you regardless, making it extremely difficult to differentiate attack telegraphs, let alone parry at the appropriate times. This is compounded by the attack intent squiggle over enemies' heads that indicates that yes, they are attacking you, but it doesn't mean that you can parry them at that moment. Blame the Batman Arkham series for this convention, but going against it requires some really fine-tuned combat AI, a closer camera, and enemies that generally wait their turn to attack instead of bodying you mid-parry. If that squiggle meant parry now, and you got some iframes during a cool parry animation, none of this would be an issue. Alternatively, a parry window slider in the settings would actually work really well too. The upcoming game No Place for Bravery has that, and it's so nice! Biomutant wants to be a top-tier spectacle fighter with big flashy attacks, tight dodges, and devastating parry counters, but ultimately, it just isn't tight enough to pull off any of those things very well. There are some seriously cool attacks, but since you can't animation cancel to dodge or parry that well, get mobbed easily, and stunned even more easily, fighting in melee gets kinda old pretty fast. From what I experienced, it just wasn't worth fighting in melee against large groups, and since most of the encounters consist of 5 to 6 foes, I just gave up on it entirely. I brought up a desire for a feeling of heavier blows earlier, and I'll reiterate it here. I would love to see the various weapons feel like they have some heft when they connect with an enemy. But even beyond that, there's a lot of room for different styles too. For example, give the bigger weapons heftier stuns, so that you can truly bully smaller enemies into the dirt if you want to. They're fodder anyway, and having them tank blows like the hulking brutes is frankly just strange. But in trade, make it slightly longer to break out of an animation if you need to parry or dodge, reflecting the heft of the weapon that you're wielding. And for the lighter weapons, give them attack animations that can be cancelled easily, allowing for quicker parries and even quicker dodges. I'd also suggest giving players ample iframes in half of their attacks, and scaling enemy damage to compensate. It's really cool walloping an enemy into the air and then jet smashing them into the ground in a burning nova. But it's significantly less cool when every other enemy in the area uses that opportunity to shoot you a few times. Which is why I switched over to using my guns, and then eventually to my psionic and mutagenic powers instead. At first I used the key ball, but because it had trouble actually hitting enemies that I was soft locked onto, I eventually switched over to a rapid-fire, radiation-based magic missile equivalent, which would home in on any foe within range. Best of all, I could use it while sprinting full tilt, so I could safely run circles around my foes while waiting for them to die. That said, I do think that the aiming system needs another pass. There's a soft lock-on system that I mentioned before, where your character will direct their attacks at whatever enemy you're looking at, but it had the bad habit of losing focus fairly often, which is pretty rough for such a high-velocity game. A solid half of my shots would whiz right by them despite the lock-on, or would pass through parts of my enemies that weren't covered by their hitbox. This was especially bad with enemies that had multiple parts that could be targeted, where I found myself throwing my keyball into the ground over and over because I was locked onto a foot, and the game never really compensated for trajectories at all. So retooling the auto-aim slightly so that it's more consistent, or letting projectiles like keyball home in on enemies slightly, would make a massive difference in ranged combat game feel. Additionally, while a hard lock-on might be a bit overpowered at times, I still think it would help more than it would hurt, especially against more mobile foes during more chaotic fights. Issue number 3, the mutation system. I went into Biomutant assuming that the weird trash squirrel player character could change drastically over the course of the game due to a substantive mutation system. Heck, they even teased this possibility in the 2017 trailer, with the main character's hand transforming rapidly to look more like a Gila monster's skin than a trash squirrel's. It would have been incredibly cool to have the ability to grow wings, extra muscle mass, cool psionic abilities, gain armor plating, spikes, etc. And we got some of those, kinda. Instead of drastically changing the player character's physiology, the existent mutation system just adds special attacks, increases resistances, or adds psionic special attacks, none of which come with a visual change to the character model. It's not necessary to have something deeper, not by a long shot, but I would have been easily 10 times more engaged with exploring, fighting, and improving my character if it meant turning him further and further into an apex evolutionary amalgam beast. And by not including that, I quickly grew bored of the character customization system and just settled with whatever worked. Issue number 4. The plot is nonsense. I'm not going to try and sugarcoat this one. The plot of Biomutant is messy. You've got a civil war between 6 different and disparate but equally meaningless tribes, giant world-destroying beasts that are trying to consume the Tree of Life, and a revenge story against some guy. Oh, and a Fable-esque struggle between light and darkness. I wrote a big, lengthy thing talking about how all of this could be improved, but honestly I'll cut it all down to this. There's just too many threads, and they don't play well with each other. Or more specifically, none of them ever seem to intertwine with the others. It's a lot like how Fallout New Vegas featured a multitude of equally deep concurrent plotlines with some degree of crossover, but in Biomutant it was handled with far less grace and even less detail. It's just too much, and they clearly didn't have enough time to develop any of them, and it would have felt far better if they had just picked 1 or 2 single storylines and really fleshed them out in a satisfying way. And they should have gotten rid of the morality system entirely, or at least the way characters react to it, because the whole story and everyone that ever talks to the main character cannot help but repeatedly and incessantly point out just how light or dark the player is. I ended up having to mute the narrator and skip all of the dialogue by the end, because the game would not stop moralizing at me for being dark aligned, just because I was trying to get revenge on the guy who ruined the main character's life. Normally I go for the good options across the board, but multiple NPCs kept pushing me to forgive multiple different mass murderers because it was the right thing to do, and it would somehow frustrate them. I'm not joking. Here's the clip.
She suggests that you forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them more.
That's stupid. Nothing annoys them more if they actually care. But if they don't give a shit, you forgiving them is just going to make them continue to walk over you repeatedly. That is not how forgiveness works. You don't forgive an unrepentant asshole unless they themselves are actively working to make amends. Putting the onus on the victim of their aggressions to forgive them is also a form of abuse, and does nothing to prevent aggressors from repeating their actions over and over again. This line of reasoning is atrocious, and reminds me of all the simpering school administrators that would endlessly handwave bullying and violence by putting the onus on the victim to be the bigger man, or woman. Well, guess what, Miss Griswold? I still haven't forgiven the kid who randomly threw my lunchbox onto the roof, forcing me to go without food for a day because the school refused to acknowledge that he had done so. Nor have I forgiven you for trying to force me to share the dessert I brought from home with the same damn kid because he threw a tantrum about not getting any for himself. That kid was an evil shit, and trying to force me to share with him was just as evil, no matter how you spin it. Yeah, I'm not over that. I had some shitty teachers. And for the record, I went full scorched earth and ate the entire dessert in one handful. It was awful, and I almost choked, but at the same time, that little shit did not get to taste a bite of my dessert, and I felt so good about it. And also at yelling Mrs. Griswold, but you know what, that's a story for another day. I am not joking when I say that the constant tirade of shaming and clumsy philosophizing was extremely exhausting, to the point where I actually turned off all the dialogue, including the narrator, and began to skip through every single conversation that I was forced to sit through. I'm honestly not sure if I missed much either, since most of the dialogue felt incredibly canned, repeated more than once, even in the main story, and never escaped the morality singularity long enough to make any semblance of sense, let alone world or character building. It's honestly kinda odd for a game that sells itself on over-the-top badassitude and silly NPCs to interact with, and visual depictions of sound effects like vroom on the screen at all times. The story itself is shockingly boring, dour, or honestly even depressing. It feels like if you took the Deadpool movie and replaced every other character in the movie with Colossus, constantly trying to convince Wade to do the right thing and be the good guy. That'd be awful, right? Funny for maybe like 5 minutes, but then after a certain point you're just kind of like, this sucks. I don't want to see this anymore, and it's not funny anymore either. It would have been far better for Biomutant to go the route of Arkham City with a sizable rogues gallery of foes spread across the map, with their own unique flavors, bases, over-the-top zany dialogue, and action, culminating in a handful of unique boss fights or cinematic sequences. But make all of it just so ridiculous, so outlandish, and so wild that it actually fits the tonality that the world, combat, and character models have. And if they really wanted to have a morality system, they should have made it ridiculous too. Like, do I want to rocket suplex the big baddie with a mecha into the heart of his own fortress, or home run him with a steel girder so hard that he leaves a visible impact on the moon? What's the difference between the two, you may ask? Who cares, I say, as long as it's fun and leaves a lasting impact on the players that see it. Issue number 5, the dialogue. Look, I love the narrator. He's great, but using him as a stand-in for all of the dialogue in the game was a serious mistake. None of the characters are allowed to have a personality when they're filtered through the narrator, save for the rockabilly NPC at the very beginning of the game.
Sounds like he thinks she does, despite your heart growing dark. There's nothing as powerful as a Mooma's love.
Everyone else is just meaningless babble, followed by an awkwardly long pause, followed by an overblown translation from the narrator. It took nearly twice as long as normal dialogue would, making an already bloated script feel even worse to experience. This fully voice-acted workaround that they created is neat for an hour or two, but then after that I lost all interest, partly compounded by the issues that I mentioned in the previous section, but it just wasn't engaging, and would have been better handled with a handful of lovingly well-made cutscenes at set points in the game, instead of every bit of dialogue throughout the entirety of it.
The box looks like a potential brain melt.
The puzzles aren't great, and Biomutant would probably be better off just without them. They amount to little more than a super simplified pipe dream where all you do is rotate the parts until the colored lines match up over and over and over and over again. I realize that there's somewhat of a passive requirement for some kind of de facto hacking lockpicking puzzle as a result of the Bethesda games, but that's a silly requirement, and I don't think any studio should ever hold themselves to that. Make mechanics good, don't make them just because they're expected. In Biomutant's case, with the lack of depth and the excess of repetition, it's probably better that they should have just had a variety of stat check locks and spent all of that extra time and effort on some other part of the game instead. The side quests are also kind of a bit of an issue, and in fact, they're pretty much non-existent, and the ones that are there are just super generic collect X and or kill X quests, and that's a darn shame. Side quests should make the world interesting, and barring that, they should at the very least be neat diversions from the game that are worth pursuing. What Biomutant should have had were a small handful of extremely well-designed quests to explain the world, to highlight different locations of import, to accentuate the faction conflict, and so on, with unique dialogue, somewhat memorable characters, and a unique reward worth pursuing. Additionally, to give players more to just do in-game, they should also have some random Radiant quests that pop up from time to time, like bandit ambushes, faction conflict battles, random NPCs that want to race the player somewhere, which would make a great segue to new locations and point of interests, rogue beasts to track down and hunt, etc., with zero weight, explanation, and decent rewards to make them worth stopping for. Biomutant does have a little bit of this ladder style with the location objectives, but once you're done with those, you're done for good. By having that touch of dynamism, it would make the world feel a lot more alive, even if it's a little more than just a parade of activities to distract the player while they go from point A to point B. Issue number 8, the marketing. This is something I have a lot of umbrage with, so it's going to take a bit. Biomutant was touted by the developers as a mix between Breath of the Wild, Ratchet & Clank, and Devil May Cry, with one of the lead developers specifically mentioning each directly by name.
But the feedback that we've been getting over the years, it's that it's kind of a strange, weird, good mix between Ratchet & Clank, Devil May Cry, Batman Arkham, and a couple of other influences.
And Biomutant is none of those. Or at least, at a surface level, it is all of those, but it's like they skimmed off the veneer of each to look good in trailers and promotional material, but without any of the actual depth that makes those games good. And by presenting it as a combination of all three without some major and honest disclosures about what they'd actually made, it feels at best disingenuous. To some degree, I think it's terribly unfair that they did this too, because from the start, it creates an unrealistic expectation that Biomutant will match up with them in at least some capacity. I noticed there was a bit of backpedaling ahead of the release, specifically pointing out how small the studio was and look at how impressive the game is because of how few people made it. And I would normally agree, but they created those expectations in the first place, then perpetuated them, and ultimately are profiting off of them. It feels like they inadvertently crafted Biomutant's vague mystique to tease gamers' imaginations, and happily rode on the ensuing hype train all the way till release day, which is exactly what games like No Man's Sky, Cyberpunk, and Anthem did, to extremely poor effect. Every single one of those games made massive promises, showed off incredible things in their trailers and previews, and failed to deliver on almost every count at launch. So yes, it is wildly unfair that everyone keeps comparing Biomutant to Breath of the Wild, Devil May Cry, and Ratchet & Clank, because yes, Experiment 101 is only 20 people with far less financial backing, and there's no way Biomutant should be held to that standard of quality. I just wish they had set proper expectations early instead of letting them spiral out of control, and that they should have only borrowed those titles' names with a giant asterisk attached. What makes it harder is the price tag that they set for the game. Issue number 9, the price. I rarely try to put a price tag on games. Okay, not that rarely, I often do. But when I do, I usually encourage developers to actually charge a bit more for their games because they're worth it. But Biomutant just isn't currently worth $60 or whatever that translates to around the world. I think I would have been far kinder with my opinions had they only charged $40. But by charging the full $60 or more implies a great deal of confidence in the quality of a game, and Biomutant just doesn't cut it. One counterpoint that I saw to this, that I do agree with, is that AAA games have set an artificial glass ceiling of sorts, and are inadvertently using that to block promising AA developers from charging what their games are actually worth. That modern AAA titles should easily be worth $120 or more, and because big studios both cannot and will not raise the price, it puts smaller studios in a pinch, where they need to charge a full $60 per copy just to keep the lights on, but can't because of the inevitable negative AAA comparison. It's a very valid point, and I would normally agree, but I'm still not sure if I'd recommend buying Biomutant at its current price tag. While there's no concrete rule when it comes to video game prices, there's some viable strategies that I'd like to highlight. Some games charge peanuts and rely on pure word of mouth and review scores to sell bucket loads of copies, like Hollow Knight and Starbound. Others charge more and rely equally on lasting reputation alongside a drip feed of progressively deeper sales to convince people to finally cave in and buy the game at their perceived maximum price. Games like Disco Elysium, or honestly most of the Western AAA market, tend to go with this strategy. But the issue with both of those strategies that I just mentioned is that they require massive amounts of positive press, word of mouth, and a lasting presence in the market to continuously drive sales. Biomutant, on the other hand, should have targeted the impulse buy threshold, at a price where people would be more than willing to buy it regardless of its flaws, either because they want to see it for themselves or because they feel like they'll still be able to get a decent amount of value out of the game without cutting too deeply into their entertainment budget. No Man's Sky is probably the best example of this, where, yes, they did charge full price at launch and got absolutely slammed for it. But whenever they release a big new update, they cut the price in half, dropping it down to $30 or less, which seems to be the perfect spot for impulse buyers to pick up the game from what I've seen. And after a couple of cycles of this, almost all of the bad press has faded away and was replaced by a decent player base and a lot of surprisingly satisfied customers. That said, they only pulled it off because they put in the time to make it good. Anthem, on the other hand, goes on sale for $10 on the regular, and, well, the hate is mostly gone. Most people still aren't very satisfied with it. Issue number 10. The studio size is no excuse. I realize at this point these are things that are kind of hard to fix for the game, but it's kind of a marketing thing, and I want people to learn from this. This is more of an issue that I'm actually going to levy against the people that are defending Biomutant. Yes, only 20 people worked on this game, but making a big game is a gamble. And while I'm honestly impressed with what Experiment 101 has done, I'm not going to commend them for falling far short of what they promised. That's like commending the National Monument of Scotland for being a partial recreation of the Parthenon. Sure, the columns and the foundation look great, but ultimately they ran out of money or time well before they hit their goal, and it shows. Sorry, but not actually sorry, Scotland. A skilled creator of any kind of content should know their limitations and try to rein in their ideas so that they can make the best product possible with the tools, time, and manpower available to them. I get that it's incredibly easy to dream big and reach far with a passion project. The more that gets out of control, the easier it is to fall far short of the mark. I realize that this advice isn't useful anymore in Biomutant's case, but I'll still suggest it to anyone following in its footsteps. One easy way to avoid scope creep is to bring on one or multiple people that aren't actually passionate about the project and don't really care that they'll be working on the next open world magnum opus. It may seem wildly counterproductive to have someone like this around, but they're the most likely person to give an unbiased opinion out of everyone there. And for small studios like Experiment 101, unbiased opinions during the early stages of a project are worth their weight in gold. Possibly literally, as tighter initial designs will save a tremendous amount of time and funds when the studio would otherwise run out of both. Ultimately, I would say that Biomutant's rough edges are so absolutely intrinsic to its core design that I'm not sure if it would be worth it to try and smooth them out. A couple of passes to polish the combat would help considerably, but beyond that, it's probably better for Experiment 101 to cut their losses and start anew using their experience with Biomutant as a foundation for another better game. Heck, I'd honestly even be on board with a Biomutant 2, with a much smaller scope, a better and far more cohesive story, and possibly no open world gameplay. We've got enough of those already, and unless a developer is willing to truly bring something new to that table, I would honestly recommend sidestepping the genre entirely in order to create a far more condensed, satisfying experience instead. There is good in Biomutant, and if you're willing to overlook a lot of the rough edges, there is a reasonable chance you will find things that you truly love. But if you're already spoiled for choice, and not overly attached to the idea of playing as a gangly, mutant scrub squirrel in a half-baked, lush post-apocalypse populated by warring factions that include a tribe of footballers of all things, then I'd probably suggest you put your time into something else. And suggest I will, right now. Here are a number of other games that I would honestly recommend instead of Biomutant, in no particular order. Maneater. Okay, so not necessarily in no particular order. I make it no secret that Maneater is my absolute favorite open world game, and it's small wonder why. The game is condensed, it's fun, it's bombastic, and it's absolute nonsense, and it never, ever outstayed its welcome. Sunset Overdrive. Speaking of bombastic, Sunset Overdrive is pretty much everything I hoped that Biomutant would be, but with weird gross humans instead of weird gross mutant scrub squirrels. This game is fantastic, and desperately deserves more attention than it originally garnered as an Xbox One release title. Horizon Zero Dawn. While its open world is equally subjected to bloat, Horizon Zero Dawn's backstory is surprisingly similar to Biomutant's, but actually has side quests and characters that are worth caring about. Ghost of Tsushima. This game is a piece of art, and exemplifies the idea of a massive open world filled with beautiful vistas and ample justification for exploring every square inch of the map in a way that I feel like Breath of the Wild didn't quite manage to get right. Starlink Battle for Atlas. This game is Ubisoft's facsimile of Star Fox crossed with their bog-standard open-world model. And honestly, it's actually pretty dang good, especially since it has Star Fox in it if you get the Switch version. Unfortunately, the game suffered from terrible storytelling and physical toy add-ons that probably sunk the game before it ever launched, but it's still a ton of fun to play all the same. And that's it, at least for now. If we're lucky, Experiment 101 will really buckle down with some extra manpower, some funds from Biomutant's launch, and some much-needed feedback and retool the game into something incredible. The bones are there, but it'll take a lot of work to smooth down the rough edges, and then rebuild atop them. But realistically, chances are Biomutant will just be another cautionary tale of dreaming just a bit too big, reaching just a bit too far, and letting the hype get too far out of hand. It's a shame, but at the same time, for every rough launch and even rougher game, there's dozens more racing to take its place. I should be disappointed, but there really are too many great games out there for me to play instead anyway. Speaking of, if there's a game that's been on your mind for its notable rough edges, tell me about it in the comments below. I'm always on the hunt for weird, slightly rough games to look over in detail, and I'm interested in what you guys might suggest. But for now, if you all liked this video in any way, shape, or form, leave me a like, it helps more than you know. And if you want to see more, hit subscribe, and check out my other videos while I work on my next one. It should be on Backseat Gaming, but like with Experiment 101 and Biomutant, I bit off far more than I could chew, and have had to go through some major roadblocks to get it done. So until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.